Hey guys, tonight we're tracing the crumbs of Canadian history. Literally. You find yourself standing on the damp shore of an unnamed lake, dawn mist curling like steam from a kettle, the rhythmic splash of paddles echoing through the still air. A flock of loons calls somewhere beyond the fog, and for a moment you almost forget that this story begins not with grand explorers or noble quests, but with lunch, crushed biscuits, half-frozen tea, and an appetite strong enough to make a person name a lake after the only thing left in his pack. You probably won't survive this kind of hunger-driven creativity, but that's okay, because tonight you don't have to. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing the world light up with all your cozy dots across the map. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the mud behind a small band of fur traders, each man layered in wool and exhaustion. Their canoes, scratched from weeks of travel, glide like patient beasts over the glassy surface of a northern lake that doesn't yet have a name. The air smells of pine, wet leather, and smoke from last night's fire. Someone, probably Baptiste, the one who never shuts up, pulls out a hard biscuit and begins gnawing like a determined squirrel. You watch as he mutters, "If this lake don't freeze us to death, I'll call it Biscuit Bay." The others laugh, but something sticks in the air. That's how so many lakes were christened in early Canada. Spontaneous, unplanned, and sometimes mid-chew. The Northwest Company men, their French-Canadian voyageurs, and the occasional Scottish trader were not poets by trade. They were practical, half-starved, and often delirious from cold. When they stopped for lunch, their imagination was ruled by whatever was in front of them: jerky, tea, a smear of jam, maybe a crumb of bannock. A lake named after a meal wasn't just a joke. It was a breadcrumb trail of survival. The year might be 1797, or maybe 1810. Historians still argue whether the earliest snack-inspired names appeared in the Hudson Bay Company's maps or in the rogue notes of independent traders. But here you are, paddling through their hunger. The water glints like glass, the horizon infinite, and every island looks the same. When you've crossed 50 lakes that all blur into one, you need a way to remember which is which. So you eat a biscuit on the North Shore and decide, with absolute authority, that this one will forever be Biscuit Lake. The smell of bacon fat lingers in your clothes from breakfast. The men joke that it's the only perfume available out here. You laugh softly, realizing how modern-day maps, so clean and precise, conceal all these greasy fingerprints of human appetite. Every name on paper once came from a real moment. A lunch break, a stomach growl, a crumb on a compass. At mid-morning, the group stops by a small rocky shore. You squat beside a pot of bubbling tea, its surface filmed with pine needles. The leader, a Scotsman named MacLeod, dips a tin cup and squints at the sun. "We'll call this Tea Lake," he says with no trace of irony. Everyone nods, because naming things feels like control. A small victory against the wilderness that wants to swallow them whole. The lake doesn't protest. It just keeps glimmering quietly, indifferent to its new label. There's something hypnotic about this rhythm. Paddle, stop, eat, name. You start to imagine that each lake is secretly flattered to be remembered, even if only as Lunch Point or Bacon Bay. And in a strange way, those names carried comfort. A traveler lost in a blizzard could think of Tea Lake and remember warmth. A few decades later, British surveyors would come with clipboards and replace some of these titles with more respectable names, often after dukes, officers, or saints. But the locals still whispered the originals. Ask an old trapper, and he'll point to Butter Lake on the map and mutter, "That's still Lard Pond to me." You can almost hear the pride in his voice. The canoe glides on. You can feel the ache in your arms, the rhythmic burn of muscle against paddle. Each stroke feels ancient, like you're carving history directly into the water. And then you notice the pack of biscuits sitting open beside your feet. Hard, tasteless, somehow essential. You pick one up, bite it, and understand why these traders got creative. Hunger makes poets of everyone. By midday, the sun is high enough to melt the edge of frost on your coat. The voyageurs pull ashore again, this time on a tiny island, barely big enough for 3 tents and a campfire. Someone digs out smoked fish from a leather pouch. Another man stirs porridge that tastes faintly of ash. Yet spirits remain absurdly high. "What shall we call this one?" a voice asks. "Fish Porridge Lake," another suggests. Laughter erupts. But somewhere in some faded logbook now stored in a Canadian archive, that exact name appears, proof that jokes can last longer than empires. Historians still argue whether this practice was deliberate whimsy or pure exhaustion. Some claim it was a code, a way for traders to track where they'd eaten certain rations. Others think it was simple boredom relief. After months of travel, the human brain starts clinging to anything funny, edible, or both. Whatever the reason, these improvised labels outlive their creators. You pause to imagine how it must have felt, standing on a lakeshore that no map has acknowledged, surrounded by endless silence, realizing that you get to name it. It's a small power, but it's yours. You might name it after your sweetheart, your hometown, or as most did, your lunch. The naming was a way to say, "I was here and I was hungry." The day stretches long. Mosquitoes hum. The wind smells of cedar and damp wool. You drift into the steady rhythm of life on the trail. Eat, paddle, joke, record, repeat. One of the voyageurs, half asleep in the canoe, mumbles that they should name the next lake after coffee, if only to manifest some. That night you find Coffee Lake scrawled on a crude map, evidence that wishful thinking sometimes wins. There's a comfort in realizing that Canada's geography was once edible in its imagination. A continent defined by cravings, fatigue, and laughter, each lake a snack-sized diary entry. You settle by the fire, feeling the heat lick your boots. Someone's frying bannock, its smell mingling with pine smoke and damp moss. You watch the grease hiss, and suddenly it feels right that such simple meals could leave names immortalized across centuries. Before you drift to sleep, you look up at the stars reflected on the lake's surface. For a second, you imagine each reflection as a crumb from the trader's meal, a celestial trail of leftovers marking their path through history. Maybe that's the secret of the past. It's built from small, forgettable moments that somehow never fade. Tomorrow, you'll follow them again, deeper into the map, where muffins, jerky, and tea would each earn their watery memorial. But for now, the night hums gently around you, and the lake, whatever you choose to call it, keeps your reflection still and warm. The next morning, the world wakes in shades of pewter and gold. You're still following the traders, your boots soaked, your fingers cold, and your patience long since packed away somewhere under a tarp with a tea kettle. The air smells of wood smoke and birch sap. Someone sneezes. Someone else swears softly in French. It's another day of paddling, eating, and, inevitably, naming. You sit in the bow of the canoe, watching a man balance an open notebook on his knee. He's the map maker, though everyone just calls him Quill. His job is to record each lake, bay, and river bend with enough accuracy that others can someday find their way. But today Quill looks distracted. He's unwrapping a small muffin. Hard, stale, probably stolen from yesterday's breakfast, and nibbling around the edges like it's sacred. You can almost hear his thoughts turning that muffin into cartography. Mapmakers with muffins, you think? It sounds ridiculous. Yet that's exactly what's happening. While his crewmates pull the canoe ashore, Quill sketches a crooked outline of the lake's perimeter, smudging the graphite with crumbs.
Then he mutters almost to himself, "Muffin Lake? That'll do." And just like that,
another piece of the wilderness gets domesticated, claimed by pastry. Historians still argue whether men like Quill truly had authority to name places, or if their doodles were simply personal notes later formalized by accident. Some believe the traders' sketchbooks were meant only as private journals, never intended to become official records. Others suggest the companies, Hudson's Bay and Northwest alike, secretly encouraged whimsical naming, knowing it helped keep morale alive during months of monotony. Either way, the muffins prevailed. You imagine a future geographer frowning at a government ledger, wondering why half the lakes in Manitoba seem to reference breakfast. Maybe he assumes it's symbolic, something to do with the nourishment of discovery. You, however, know better. It was just men with cold fingers and crumbs on their maps. The journey continues north. The landscape sharpens into granite and moss, the trees thinner now, their branches creaking like old ships. Every few miles, a new lake opens like an ink blot beneath the paddle strokes. They all look the same, but Quill insists each one is unique. Like pastries, he says. Same ingredients, different mood. You roll your eyes, but can't help smiling. By midday, the traders stop for lunch again. They spread their blankets on a patch of dry lichen and unpack what's left of yesterday's rations: jerky, tea, and those tragic muffins. The scene feels almost civilized except for the black flies the size of raisins. One of the voyageurs, a wiry man named Etienne, dips his muffin in tea and declares, "Now it's soup." The others groan, but someone writes it down anyway. That's the quiet magic of these moments. You never know which joke will outlive everyone present. Historians later find Muffin Lake, or Tea Crumb Bay, on maps and assume great stories lie behind them, unaware that the truth was probably closer to laughter and caffeine withdrawal. The sky darkens slightly, threatening rain. You pack up and paddle on, the rhythm steady, hypnotic. Quill sits at the center, cross-legged, scribbling notes while balancing another muffin on his lap. You wonder how many names were born this way, in haste, in hunger, in the faint hope that someone would remember them. By evening, they reach a larger body of water, wide enough to take your breath away. The reflection of clouds turns the surface into molten silver. Everyone falls silent for a moment. The grandeur of it all, the size, the silence, the sense that you're standing where no one has stood before, makes you feel small. Then Baptiste, always eager to ruin solemn moments, unwraps a blueberry muffin from his pack. He takes one bite and sighs. "We call it Blueberry Lake," he says through a mouthful. "For the good fruit that got us this far." Quill grins, and before anyone can object, he writes it down. The name sticks. That's the funny thing about history. It's not always deliberate. Sometimes it's a coincidence baked into bread. Later, as the rain finally arrives, you sit beneath a tarp with the traders, listening to droplets drum on canvas. The smell of wet earth fills the air. Someone passes you a muffin that tastes faintly of smoke and river water. You take a bite, not because it's good, but because you're hungry, and that's exactly how these men lived. Everything, from a soggy meal to a lake's name, came from necessity. In the flickering lamplight, Quill flips through his notebook. You catch glimpses of earlier entries. Pemmican Creek, Butter Bay, Salt Lake, no salt found. The handwriting wobbles with the motion of canoes, yet there's a tenderness in it. Each line is a breadcrumb trail through wilderness and time. Do you ever think about who will read this? You ask him quietly. He shrugs. If anyone gets this far, they deserve to name the next one. You can't help but laugh. By now, the rain has softened to mist. The fire pops and hisses. Etienne plays a tin whistle, its melody slow and wistful. The rest of the men fall into silence, staring at the trembling reflections of flame on their teacups. You realize that these traders, often portrayed as rugged and stoic, were also dreamers in disguise. Naming lakes after muffins and biscuits wasn't childish. It was survival through imagination. Somewhere out there, a later explorer will find Blueberry Lake and assume it honors a local plant, or perhaps an indigenous legend about summer fruit. And while that may be partly true, you'll know another version, the one where a soggy pastry and a tired joke turned into immortality. Historians still argue whether these naming habits were acts of rebellion, traders mocking the pompous, formalities of colonial map-making, or simply the byproduct of boredom, maybe both. After all, when you're weeks from civilization, any small act of humor feels like resistance. The night grows colder. You pull your blanket tighter and listen to the lake sigh against the rocks. Somewhere in the darkness, a loon calls again, lonely but comforting. The sound echoes across the water, through time, through maps, through history itself. You think about how these men, hungry, half frozen, and surrounded by mosquitoes, managed to leave their fingerprints on a country not through conquest, but through crumbs. And maybe that's the most human legacy of all. As you drift toward sleep, you imagine Quill's notebook fluttering open in the wind, muffin crumbs scattering into the grass. Tomorrow they'll move on to another lake, another meal, another joke that sticks. And somewhere, hundreds of years later, someone will whisper those same names aloud, unaware they're repeating the taste of history. The dawn comes late and pale, with the color of old parchment. The frost hasn't quite left the ground yet, and the men wake coughing, their breath curling like ghosts over the embers. You're already sitting up, rubbing your hands together, when Etienne begins rummaging through his pack with the desperation of a man searching for treasure. He finds something, a long, leathery strip of moose jerky, and waves it like a victory flag. Breakfast. You chew along with him, even though it feels like eating old shoelaces. The salt burns your lips and your jaw aches. You can almost hear the moose laughing from beyond the grave. Still, it's food, and food means hope. Somewhere between bites, Baptiste declares, "If I ever find another piece of this cursed meat, I'll throw it in the lake and name it after my suffering." Everyone laughs. Everyone except Etienne, who has a more tragic relationship with jerky. Last week, he dropped half his rations into a river. He'd been drying them on a rock when the wind kicked up, and in they went, jerky, string and all. The memory still stings. So when the group paddles onward, Etienne stares at the next body of water with squinted vengeance. "Jerky Lake," he mutters darkly. Quill looks up from his map and shrugs. Fine name. Descriptive. And just like that, an accident becomes a landmark. Historians still argue whether the name Jerky Lake in northern Ontario originated from a lost ration or from a local nickname for dried meat trading posts. Either way, the origin feels personal, something between misfortune and inside joke. That's how so many places got their names. Private laughter made public. You paddle along the lake's rippling surface, thinking about how many mistakes are immortalized on maps. A bad lunch, a slipped hand, a forgotten pen stroke, all still visible centuries later. It's strangely comforting. The men steer toward a rocky shore for lunch. Etienne insists on cooking this time, claiming he's invented a better way to soften jerky. He drops it into a pot of boiling water with a dash of flour and something that might be tea leaves. The result smells like regret and bravery. You take a polite sip and immediately regret it. Perfect, Baptiste says, face deadpan. We'll call this place Stew Lake. Everyone snorts. Someone throws a twig into the pot for flavor. The name, of course, sticks again. You're beginning to realize that the Canadian wilderness was named one meal at a time, not out of grandeur, but out of the need to laugh in order to stay sane. As the day goes on, the mood lightens. Quill sketches small cartoons in the margins of his map. Tiny canoes, steaming mugs, a frowning jerky strip wearing a crown. His handwriting wobbles as the canoe rocks, giving the whole map a kind of sleepy charm. You lean over to peek and see that he's written, Jerky Lake, named in sorrow, survived in humor. There's something deeply human in that. These men didn't know they were writing history. They were just trying to remember where they'd been without losing their minds in the process. The sky begins to warm to gold. The lakes stretch endlessly, one after another like the beads of a broken necklace. You're somewhere near the trading routes of Lake Winnipeg now, though exact geography hardly matters. The wilderness is a repeating pattern of rock, water, and silence. You watch Etienne tying a bundle of pelts to the canoe's stern. He hums a tune that sounds older than anyone here. My father named a pond once, he tells you. He was trapping alone for months. Said he dropped his bread in it and called it Loaf Pond. The bread sank, but the name floated forever. You grin. You think that's still on a map somewhere? Maybe, he says, eyes glinting. If not, it's still true. Later, the crew camps on a small ridge overlooking the lake. The sun falls behind the pines and the water glows orange. Baptiste pulls out his journal, less official than Quill's, more like a chaos of doodles and complaints. You peek over his shoulder and read, Lost one sock, gained one mosquito bite. Named a lake after jerky. Felt proud briefly. The entry makes you laugh quietly and he smirks. You gotta keep track of something, eh? That night the campfire burns slow and low. Etienne passes around strips of smoked trout, better than jerky marginally, and you listen to their laughter. You realize that every one of these men, even the roughest, has a story of naming. Each lake name carries fingerprints of humor, fatigue, and desperation wrapped up together. There's one story Baptiste tells before turning in. It's about a trader named McGregor who supposedly named Tea Biscuit Lake after losing a bet. The wager? That he could keep his biscuit dry through an entire storm crossing. He didn't. Historians still debate whether McGregor existed or if he's the collective invention of voyageurs who needed a scapegoat for soggy lunches. Either way, the lake exists. Its name still printed in the delicate italics of government maps. You picture McGregor, soaked, shivering, clutching a soggy biscuit, muttering, "Fine, I'll name the lake after it, and maybe then it'll stop haunting me." It didn't, of course. But you can't help smiling. There's poetry in the pettiness of it all. By midnight the camp grows quiet. The wind whispers through spruce needles. You can still smell the jerky stew, faint and oddly comforting. The lake below mirrors the moon perfectly, as if the world itself has been split in two. One for travelers, one for their reflections. You think about how fragile names are, and yet how persistent. The traders will move on, their maps will change hands, but the lakes will remain, quiet, shining. Unconcerned about whether they're named after love, loss, or lunch, you drift into half-sleep. dreaming of floating maps covered in crumbs. Somewhere a ghostly hand writes "Jerky Lake" in looping script, and the ink turns into ripples. When you wake again, the fire has died to coals, and the men are already packing. Etienne hums softly, his mood lighter. "Next lake," he says, "and we name for Joy." Baptiste grins. "Then I hope someone brought pie." You laugh, shouldering your pack. Ahead of you, the horizon glows faintly pink, promising another cold morning, another warm story, and, inevitably, another name born from lunch. The next lake greets you not with glory, but with grumbling stomachs, and a wind so sharp it feels like it's trying to slice the world in half. Your fingers ache from rowing. The trader's laughter is quieter today, replaced by the rhythm of paddles slapping water, and the occasional groan from someone who hasn't felt warm in 3 days. You can tell everyone's spirits are sinking. Morale, like their bread, has gone soggy. The map maker, Quill, hasn't cracked a joke since sunrise, and Etienne's tea kettle has gone missing, a crime that might soon lead to mutiny. The men pull ashore mid-morning, shivering. You follow them to a clearing where a crooked pine leans over a half-frozen pond. Baptiste, ever the optimist, produces the last few leaves of black tea and some stale bread. The water, drawn from the lake, looks a little suspiciously brown. Still, you all gather around the pot as it begins to hiss and steam, the scent of tannin and desperation filling the air. The first sip burns your tongue, and you can't tell whether it's bitterness or relief that spreads through you. The bread, dunked and steaming, has the texture of wet parchment. Quill glares at his cup. "This tea tastes like bark and disappointment," he mutters. Etienne grunts. "That's because it is bark and disappointment." And then, snap! The brittle patience of the camp cracks in two. Quill, whose pencil has broken for the 3rd time this morning, stands up too fast, sending his tea flying across the snow. He curses loudly, something about God-forsaken lakes, and storms toward his map case. The others freeze mid-bite, watching as Quill furiously scribbles on his parchment. "You know what?" he growls. "Tea Lake is taken. This one, this cursed puddle, is Bitter Brew Lake." A long silence follows. Then Baptiste starts laughing. It spreads, contagious as smoke. Etienne claps Quill on the back, and even the map-maker's anger crumbles. "Fine," he admits. "Bitter brew it is." And just like that, another lake earns a name, born from tantrum and tannin. Historians still argue whether the bitter brew lakes scattered across Canada refer to bad tea, spoiled coffee, or the general emotional state of travelers. Some claim that the naming tradition began as a kind of in-joke among fur brigades, a way to document not the terrain, but their collective suffering in beverage form. Others suspect it was just an easy way to mark rest stops where someone spilled something. Either way, the result was the same. A map dotted with memories that taste faintly of oversteeped leaves. The rest of the day drifts in slow motion. You paddle again, letting the rhythmic creak of oars pull you back into calm. The sun fights its way through a veil of cloud, flashing gold over the water, and for a brief moment the lake doesn't seem so bitter after all. You realize that anger out here burns fast. It's too cold to hold grudges. By mid-afternoon, the voyagers pull into a narrow channel. Etienne, now in better spirits, insists on making a proper tea this time. He adds spruce needles, claiming it's vitamin something. The result smells like Christmas and tastes like punishment, but everyone drinks anyway, laughing at the absurdity of pretending to be connoisseurs in the middle of nowhere. Baptiste takes a long sip, grimaces dramatically, and says, yes. Notes of despair with a hint of swamp. You nearly choke on your drink. That's accurate, you manage. He nods sagely. We'll call it Swampy Blend Lake. Quill just sighs. Please no, too late. Etienne has already carved the words into a piece of driftwood. That evening, the crew sets up camp by a low hill dotted with blueberries, long since frozen. The sun bleeds red over the horizon, turning the world copper and quiet. Quill sits by the fire, notebook open, his earlier anger replaced with sheepish amusement. I'll keep the name, he admits. Bitter Brew has character? The rest nod approvingly. You can almost feel the shared pride in having turned a miserable lunch into a lasting legacy. Later, as night creeps in, someone mentions an old rumor about a group of traders further west who supposedly named a lake Soggy Bread after losing their entire supply during a storm. Historians still argue whether that's true, Etienne says, eyes glinting in the firelight. But I think truth out here is just whatever name survives the winter. You mull that over, watching sparks rise like tiny stars. Maybe he's right. The wilderness doesn't care what names you give it. The names are for you, to remember, to laugh, to prove you existed long enough to eat something terrible and complain about it. In the firelight, Baptiste begins sketching caricatures of everyone in the dirt. Quill with his broken pencil, Etienne holding a tea kettle like a trophy, you with biscuit crumbs on your face. He titles the drawing The Breakfast Cartographers. You can't stop laughing. When the laughter fades, the forest falls quiet again. Only the soft lap of waves and the hiss of the kettle remain. You sip your cooling tea and realize that this silly ritual of naming lakes after snacks isn't just about humor. It's about control in a place where everything else controls you. The weather, the hunger, the endless miles of water. Each name, no matter how ridiculous, says, "We were here. We made it through this day." Before turning in, Quill adds one last note to his journal. The tea was bitter, but the laughter sweetened it. Bitter Brew Lake shall remind us that even bad days deserve names. You fall asleep to that thought, listening to the steady slosh of the lake just beyond the tent flap. The wind sighs through the pines, brushing the canvas with fingers of frost. In your dreams, the lakes blend together, each one a memory steeped in laughter and steam. Tomorrow will bring new mistakes, new meals, and new names. But tonight, you rest easy knowing that even your worst cup of tea might someday ripple across a map, whispered by someone centuries from now who'll never know how truly awful it tasted. By now, your boots are more mud than leather, and you've lost count of how many lakes you've passed that seem to have been named after someone's lunch. You trudge onward through a tangle of spruce and mosquito fog, the sound of your paddle still ghosting in your ears even when the canoe's strapped to your shoulders. Ahead lies another nameless patch of blue on the map, or rather, one waiting to be christened by the rumbling stomachs of fur traders long before you ever showed up. You stop, pull a bit of dried meat from your pack, and realize that, yes, once again, this story is about hunger as much as it is about geography. The thing about the Canadian fur trade is that it wasn't just commerce. It was cuisine in survival mode. Trappers and voyageurs, French, Scottish, Cree, Métis, and a dozen other identities woven through each other, didn't have Michelin stars or menu boards. They had bannock, pemmican, smoked fish, and maybe, if they were lucky, a handful of berries picked between rainstorms. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was morale, memory, and sometimes map-maker. When you're spending months hauling beaver pelts across portages with names like Misery Lake and Mosquito, Narrows, the best way to keep spirits high is to joke that the next puddle you cross will be called Sausage Pond. And sometimes the joke stuck. That's how so many lakes earned their savory reputations. Lake Pemmican, an actual spot tucked deep in Manitoba, supposedly got its name when a band of voyageurs, half-starved and half-delirious, tore into their pemmican stash beside the shore. They scribbled the name on their trade map in grease-stained script. Historians still argue whether the story's true or if the name was later applied by nostalgic cartographers, but the romance of it remains. Imagine sitting there in a cloud of black flies, chewing a chunk of buffalo fat and berries, and thinking, yeah, this lake deserves a name that tastes like survival. Your hand brushes the cool surface of the water, and you wonder what it felt like to eat the same food day after day. Pemmican, equal parts fat, dried meat, and sometimes berries, was basically the first protein bar, long before anyone thought to market one with an energy drink logo. It didn't spoil, didn't freeze solid, and didn't exactly taste like victory either. But it kept men alive through winters so cold that ink froze before it hit the page. A fur trader might carry 90 pounds of the stuff, enough to last weeks if rationed properly, or days if morale collapsed into hunger-driven frenzy. You hear your stomach growl and almost laugh. Maybe hunger is the great unifier across centuries. Somewhere, 200 years ago, another traveler stood at this very shore, tasting the same wind and wishing for something other than pemmican. He might have joked about calling this Soup Lake, or Cracker Bay, or Coffee Cove, though coffee was a luxury rarely hauled this far inland. Still, in a few rare instances, those cravings literally marked the map. There's even a tea lake in Ontario, named because a trader's kettle cracked during a break, scattering tea leaves across the sand. They brewed the gritty result anyway, claimed it was the best cup they'd ever had, and decided the lake deserved the credit. And that's the thing about these names. They were never chosen out of ceremony. There wasn't a council meeting or a royal decree. It was improvisation born from exhaustion. Sometimes the naming was pragmatic. We stopped here for lunch, therefore it's Lunch Lake. Other times it was a joke that became immortal. Take Bacon Ridge in Alberta, which, yes, exists. The story goes that a pack of salted pork split open on the trail, and the smell drew a bear into camp that night. Nobody slept, but in the morning, everyone agreed. The place would forever be remembered as Bacon Ridge, because humor is how you survive in bear country. You can almost hear the laughter echoing across the years. Rough, tired, but real. You imagine how, in the quiet between paddles, they might swap stories of home cooking, of mother's soups or tavern pies. Those memories must have been as sustaining as the pemmican itself. The naming of lakes became a secret language of longing. Each title, Bread Lake, Biscuit Bay, Tea Harbor, was a whispered promise that civilization still existed somewhere downstream. It's easy to romanticize now, but the reality was often grim. Some names are all that survived of men who didn't. Cold Bannock Creek, Starvation Bay, Last Breakfast Lake. They sound funny until you realize they were earned through hunger that bordered on despair. When food ran out, naming became an act of rebellion, a way to assert control over wilderness that didn't care if you lived or died. A lake named after your lunch was proof that you'd at least made it that far. Still, not every story has such tragic undertones. There's a legend among Cree elders about a small, mirror-flat lake in northern Saskatchewan that traders called Honey Lake. Not because anyone had honey, but because a beaver dam nearby shimmered golden in the sunset, and one exhausted voyageur swore it looked like a giant honeycomb. His crewmates teased him mercilessly, calling him Bee-Man for months, but the name stuck. Historians still argue whether that's where the modern Honey Lake got its title, or if it was renamed later by surveyors. But between you and me, I'll take the B story any night. You pause to sip from your flask. Just water, but it tastes faintly metallic, like history itself. Around you, the forest hums with unseen things. The creak of birch, the distant call of a loon, the slap of water against the shore. Everything feels timeless here, like you could peel back the centuries and find a canoe gliding past. A man humming a French tune about the long road home. The air smells faintly of pine and smoke, and if your imagination's sharp enough, maybe even bacon. The humor in those names hides something deeper, though. A mapping system built on human moments. The Hudson's Bay Company, for instance, sometimes adopted trader nicknames into official ledgers because they were the only references available. A lake called Snack Point on one map might become Petit Déjeuner Lake on another, reflecting the bilingual chaos of Canada's frontier. Eventually, those casual monikers made their way into royal surveys and atlases. Whole regions today still carry the linguistic fingerprints of lunches long devoured. And here's your quirky tidbit. In 1824, a fur trader named François Bélanger is said to have renamed a previously mapped lake after the stale biscuit he dropped into it. He supposedly muttered, "There goes my last meal," before marking it down as Biscuit Lake. No one corrected him. You can visit Biscuit Lake today. Though, to be fair, there are several Biscuit Lakes scattered across Canada, so you might end up at the wrong snack. But even stranger, archaeologists once uncovered an old campfire site near one of those Biscuit Lakes, with fragments of charred bread inside clay. When tested, they found traces of wild rice, suggesting that the voyagers might have experimented with baking bannock using local grains, blending European and indigenous culinary traditions. That tiny discovery adds flavor to the story, literally and figuratively. It's a reminder that the fur trade wasn't a one-way road of exploration. It was cultural exchange kneaded into dough. As twilight drapes the tree line, you settle down and watch the lake turn from blue to black glass. The names you realize aren't just oddities on a map. They're breadcrumbs of memory, left by travelers who wanted to be remembered not for conquest or wealth, but for the simplest of all human acts, eating together. You feel a kinship with them across centuries. The laughter, the hunger, the stubbornness to mark a lake with something as trivial as a snack. It all speaks of resilience. Out here, the wilderness doesn't reward grand gestures, but it honors small joys. And what could be smaller or sweeter than the taste of lunch shared beside an unknown shore that someone once decided to call Tea Lake? Your eyelids grow heavy. The wind hums through the spruce. Somewhere far away, the echo of paddles drips into silence. By now, your sense of time feels as fluid as the lakes themselves. You've lost track of how many sunrises you've seen reflected on the water, or how many times you've shaken crumbs out of your pack while staring at a horizon that looks just like yesterday's. The world of the fur traders is beginning to fold around you. The rhythm of paddles, the creak of wooden ribs in cold water, the endless catalog of lakes named after things you could eat, or wished you could. Your canoe slides through a narrow channel where reeds whisper like gossip. A dragonfly skims your shoulder. You could almost imagine you're part of a convoy from 1790. A flotilla of canoes heavy with pelts, guided by men who knew every bend of the river by heart, every rock and rapid by name. And those names, you're realizing, are the true menu of the wilderness. By the time the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company were in their fiercest rivalry, the naming of lakes and rivers had become almost a side sport. Traders would race not only for beaver pelts, but also for the honor of naming a new waterway. And since naming rights often went to whoever reached it first, speed, And sometimes luck played as big a role as discovery. First come, first lunch, you might say. Historians still argue whether some of the most famous food-related lake names were deliberate branding or just desperate humor. Take Pork Lake in Ontario. One map attributes it to a lost barrel of salted pork, another to a trader nicknamed Porky, who supposedly drowned there. Either way, both stories speak to how intertwined appetite and identity were in the trade routes. Every name, every mark on those crude maps was a story about someone's relationship with survival. You can almost hear the banter of the voyageurs as they pull ashore, a mix of French and Ojibwe with laughter carrying over the waves. They toss their paddles onto the sand, stretch, and argue about who gets the first bite of bannock. One of them perhaps takes a chunk of cold, greasy meat, waves it toward the lake, and declares, "From now on, this place shall be called Lunch Lake." It sounds absurdly casual, but it's how history was often made, in half-joking moments that became permanent ink. And here's where the story deepens. The indigenous peoples who lived across these waterways for millennia had their own naming traditions. Sacred, practical, poetic. A lake might be called Wapisusakahikan, White Swan Lake, or Mississippi, Great River, long before Europeans ever showed up. But as fur traders pushed deeper into the interior, they often overwrote those ancient names with their own, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes out of bureaucracy. Yet even in this act of colonial renaming, the food-inspired titles stood out for being oddly human. They weren't about power or conquest. They were about hunger, fatigue, humor. Things everyone understood. A quirky tidbit. There's a small egg lake in northern Alberta that got its name not from chickens, because, really, what chicken would survive out here? But from a cache of duck eggs traders found and promptly ate for breakfast. They marked the spot so they could come back next spring. The eggs were gone the next year, and the traders accused each other of overharvesting. But the name endured. You can still find Egg Lake today, its shoreline dotted with reeds and maybe, just maybe, a few ducks keeping the legend alive. Food was currency, comfort, and even diplomacy. When traders met indigenous guides or rival companies, they often began negotiations by sharing a meal. Bannock and tea were the lingua franca of the wilderness, universal, humble, and essential. Imagine sitting on the rocky edge of a lake with a stranger, both of you smelling like smoke and leather, tearing a single loaf of bread in half. That moment of sharing carried more weight than a handshake ever could. It's easy to see how a lake could end up being named after such a meal, a commemoration of peace sealed with crumbs and conversation. Still, not every name was so sentimental. Some carried irony sharp enough to cut through snow. Fat Man Lake in Saskatchewan, for example, supposedly earned its name when a portly trader's canoe capsized mid-lunch, scattering his precious provisions across the water. His companions teased him for weeks, saying the lake had eaten as much as he had. Historians still argue whether the story is apocryphal, but even if it is, you have to admit, it's one of the most relatable naming origins in history. As you paddle, the repetition of the stroke becomes hypnotic. You start to think about how language and appetite travel together. Every spoonful of soup or bite of bannock named a piece of land that would later appear in atlases and GPS databases. Modern cartographers often shake their heads at the whimsical nature of these titles, but secretly there's admiration there too. Each name is a window into an exhausted mind that still found room for humor. Some scholars point out that these snack-based names also served a practical function. They helped travelers remember locations. A lake where you ate bread might be more memorable than one simply marked Lake Number 12. After all, in a world without road signs, memory was the only map that mattered. Meet me at T Creek carried more meaning than coordinates ever could. You beach your canoe at a rocky point that juts into the glassy surface of another lake. It's unnamed on your old map, just a blob of ink. But you can almost hear the echoes of laughter here. Maybe this was one of those places that never made it into the records. Maybe it was Cheese Point or Apple Lake to someone whose journal was lost to time. The wilderness keeps its own secrets. You take a seat on the cool stone and imagine what lunch must have felt like for them. Not a break, but a reprieve from monotony. Even a stale crust of bannock or a sip of river tea could taste like heaven after 12 hours of hauling canoes through mud. It wasn't gourmet dining, but it was civilization in miniature. The moment they sat down to eat, they reclaimed a bit of humanity from the endless wild. That act, and the name that followed, was a declaration. We were here, and we were hungry. Here's another odd gem. Pickle Lake, in northwestern Ontario. No, they didn't have jars of dill pickles sloshing around in the canoes. The name came later, adapted from the Cree word, pikitau, meaning muddy, which some English-speaking map-maker misheard as pickle. It's a perfect example of linguistic telephone, a snack-related misunderstanding that somehow stuck forever. And yet, even through that mistake, there's something fitting. The land itself got marinated in human error, preserved like the food it was named for. You find yourself smiling at the absurdity of it all. Somewhere between survival and satire, these traders created one of the strangest culinary maps in history. A grid of lakes that, taken together, form a menu. Soup, tea, biscuit, bacon, egg, honey, and maybe even pickle. You could almost plan a picnic route across Canada using nothing but appetite as your compass. A loon calls in the distance, its cry stretching across the water like a reminder that time moves differently here. You dip your fingers into the lake and feel the chill seep into your skin. It's easy to romanticize these stories from a distance, but the truth is, each one came from exhaustion, from men too tired to think of anything but food and shelter. Yet somehow, in their hunger, they gave these places names that make you smile centuries later. Your paddle cuts through the mirrored surface again. The ripples fan outward, distorting the reflection of the clouds. Soft, slow, endless. You think about how each wave, each word, each laugh shared over a scrap of food left its imprint on the landscape. The wilderness might have swallowed their camps, their bones, their fires, but the names remain. And as the sun dips low, painting the water gold, you realize you're tracing their path not just through geography, but through appetite, the most honest cartographer of all. You wake before dawn, or maybe you never really slept, just drifted in and out as the lake breathed mist over your tent flap. There's a rhythm here, an old one, where every ripple and gust of wind feels like it's whispering some half-forgotten story. You listen closely and it almost sounds like laughter. The same laughter that once echoed off these shores when traders, half mad with hunger, half drunk on fatigue, decided to name the next stretch of water after their lunch. You boil a bit of lake water in your tin mug. Tea so weak it's practically just hot hope. And it hits you. This ritual hasn't changed all that much. You're drinking what they drank, staring into the same fog, probably thinking about breakfast. You take a sip and grimace. Yep, still tastes like history. The canoe glides easily this morning. Your muscles have adapted to the motion, the way your body sways with the rhythm of the water. It's the same hypnotic movement that defined the fur trade routes, a physical poetry of repetition, Stroke, lift, drip, repeat. And in that rhythm, you start to understand something those traders knew by instinct. Naming a place isn't just labeling it. It's giving your exhaustion somewhere to live. Take, for example, Bannock Point. There are several of them scattered across Canada, each claiming to be the real Bannock Point. Some say it began on Lake Winnipeg, where a group of Scots voyageurs, desperate for something familiar, baked a loaf on a flat rock using a mix of flour, salt, and animal fat. When it didn't burn, a minor miracle in the rain, they decided it deserved a name, Bannock Point. Others insist it came from a Cree camp where bread was shared with French traders as a sign of friendship. Historians still argue which is true, but both versions hold the same heart. A simple meal bridging two worlds. It's almost poetic, isn't it? A flatbread uniting people who couldn't even agree on how to pronounce Saskatoon. You can't help but imagine them. Smoke rising, tea bubbling, jokes tossed around in 3 languages. The names they left behind weren't acts of conquest. They were snapshots of coexistence, however fleeting. You steer the canoe toward a narrow inlet. The smell of spruce deepens. You think of another story, lesser known but strangely beautiful, Jam Lake in northern Saskatchewan. The legend goes that 2 traders accidentally dropped their only tin of berry jam into the water while unloading supplies. The jam burst open, staining the lake's surface with a reddish sheen. The men cursed, laughed, and declared that the lake had better enjoy its feast because they sure wouldn't. When they returned a year later, the name Jam Lake was already in circulation. Passed from camp to camp like gossip, you laugh softly to yourself. Imagine losing your lunch and gaining immortality. There's something weirdly comforting about that. Here's a quirky fact for you. Fur traders' journals often included recipes, or at least improvisations, that counted as such. Bannock variations, dried meat stews, even makeshift puddings made from crushed berries and melted snow. It's a culinary archaeology of necessity, and a reminder that these weren't just traders or explorers, but people trying to eat decently while hauling hundreds of pounds of pelts through mosquito purgatory. And those recipes? They traveled. Métis families along the Red River passed them down through generations. Bannock became more than a frontier meal. It became a cultural emblem, something made in celebration and sorrow alike. Today you can still find it sizzling in cast-iron pans at festivals and family gatherings. The same bread that once gave its name to lonely points and windy shores now anchors communities across the country. You trail your fingers through the water, watching ripples widen into soft rings. The air smells faintly of pine resin and ash. You think about how language and landscape have been braided together here. Cree, French, English, and everything in between. A lake named T might sit beside one called Wabascow, both holding layers of meaning like sediment. Historians still argue whether the fur traders' snack-based names were acts of trivial humor or desperate documentation. Maybe they were both. Naming a lake after your lunch might seem silly now, but in a world where your next meal wasn't guaranteed, it was an act of hope, a way to mark not just where you were, but that you'd survived long enough to eat. As the sun lifts, you spot another mark on your map. Cabbage Point. That one makes you pause. Cabbage. Out here. Turns out, the name came from wild water plants, likely bulrushes, that traders jokingly called northern cabbage. They'd boil them in bear fat to soften the taste. You wrinkle your nose just thinking about it. A 10-10 on creativity, maybe a 2-10 on flavor. But here's the thing. Each of these stories shows that even in the harshest places, humor was as vital as food. The ability to laugh at your own misery is the truest survival skill. Sourdough Creek, Cheese Point, Bacon Ridge. They're the punchlines of people who refuse to let the wilderness have the last laugh. And yet, you feel the melancholy under the humor, too. Some of these lakes mark final meals. Last Supper Lake, Starvation Bay, Cold Tea Creek. They remind you that laughter and loss often share the same campfire. The men who named these places might have vanished into snowstorms months later, but their jokes stayed, fossilized in maps, whispered by wind over water. You pause to rest. The world around you is still except for the rustle of birch leaves. You close your eyes and imagine one of those traders sitting where you are now, carving the word jam or bannock into a paddle handle to remember a moment of absurdity. Maybe he thought no one would ever care. Maybe he just wanted to mark the day he didn't starve. It hits you. These names, silly as they seem, are actually memorials of endurance. The lakes were witnesses to the fragile balance between comedy and catastrophe. When a man laughed and named a bay soup cove, it was his way of saying, "I'm still here. And you? You're here too, centuries later, repeating their ritual, mapping hunger with words, chasing ghosts of laughter across mirrored waters." As dusk stretches across the tree line, the lake shifts color, turning from silver to bruised violet. The air cools, and the first stars appear, reflected in ripples like breadcrumbs leading into infinity. You start a small fire and roast something simple, maybe just bread and tea, and the smell blends with the smoke, carrying the memory of all those forgotten lunches skyward. You can't help whispering a name to the darkness, something like Traveler's Snack Bay. You imagine it catching the ear of some future wanderer. Maybe they'll see it on a map one day and smile without knowing why. Because that's what naming does. It keeps laughter alive long after the voices are gone. Morning again, or what passes for morning in this endless land of mist and mirror water, the world feels half asleep, like it's waiting for you to whisper it awake. Your paddle dips softly, and each stroke sends tiny circles across the still surface, distorting the reflection of clouds until they look like spilled milk. You almost smile, because if the fur traders had seen that, they probably would have called this Milk Lake, and it would have stuck for the next 2 centuries. The thought of that makes you laugh under your breath. It's the same kind of laughter those men used to fight off despair. After all, how else do you stay sane when you're living off dried meat and melted snow, weeks from civilization? Naming a lake after your snack wasn't just whimsy. It was rebellion against the emptiness, a small edible flag planted in a wilderness too vast to ever truly belong to anyone. You pull into shore, dragging the canoe onto a bed of smooth stones. The forest smells of dew and wood smoke, faint, ancient, grounding. You stretch your arms and imagine what this landing might have looked like 250 years ago. A cluster of canoes pulled up in a crooked line, traders unloading bundles of pelts, a thin column of smoke twisting up from a morning fire. Someone stirs a pot of river tea, someone else gnaws on bannock, and someone, inevitably, jokes, "Well, boys, I guess we'll call this Porridge Bay." And maybe that's how it happened. No grand speech, no flag ceremony, just a few men laughing through exhaustion. Historians still argue whether such names were ever officially recorded by the Hudson's Bay Company, or whether they simply seeped into maps through repetition, whispered from one camp to another until even bureaucrats started writing them down. Either way, the fact remains. Canada's geography was once written by hungry people with tired hands. It's strange, isn't it? You think about how much history we owe to lunch breaks. The Great North wasn't just mapped by courage and greed, but by appetite. Biscuit Bay, Tea Lake, Egg Lake. You could almost make a grocery list out of the map. And between those names lies the truth, that survival is as much about humor as it is about endurance. Here's one of the quirkiest tidbits of all. Chocolate Lake, near Halifax, Nova Scotia. Tourists often assume it's named for its brownish water, but locals tell an older story, that during the late fur trading period, a merchant traveling inland spilled a crate of imported cocoa powder near the shore, turning the shallows sweet and brown. Whether that's myth or marketing, no one knows. But the lake still carries the name. And if you close your eyes, maybe even the scent of something comforting drifting across the wind. You sit down beside the water, chewing a piece of dried fruit you found at the bottom of your pack, your own tiny tribute to all those nameless traders. The sweetness feels almost ceremonial. You imagine them watching, nodding in approval from somewhere just beyond the tree line. What they left behind wasn't just trails or trade posts. It was an emotional cartography. You can trace it in every silly, stubborn name still dotting the map. Jam Lake, Bacon Ridge, Bannock Point, each one a story of ordinary hunger made immortal. And when you think about it, maybe that's the most human legacy of all. Not empires or treaties, but the memory of someone sitting down to eat and deciding that moment mattered enough to name. As you pack your gear, you notice how the forest seems to close in behind you, swallowing your footprints as if to say, the story's done, but the land remains. You take one last look at the lake, its surface smooth now, reflecting nothing but the color of the sky, and realize you can't tell where water ends and air begins. Maybe that's how those traders felt too, suspended between worlds, between hunger and humor, civilization and wilderness. You dip your paddle one final time. The water parts, soft as silk, and for a moment it feels like you're paddling not through geography, but through memory itself, every stroke erasing distance between then and now. The names blur together: biscuit, tea, honey, jam, a strange poetry stitched into the landscape by tired hands and empty stomachs. You wonder if they ever imagined their jokes would outlast them, if they knew that long after the fur trade faded, after the companies folded and the canoes rotted into the soil, people would still whisper their names like bedtime stories. You smile. Maybe they did. Maybe that was the point all along, to leave something light-hearted in a world that took itself far too seriously. The canoe glides out toward open water again. The air grows cooler, the sound softer. Somewhere out there, another lake waits unnamed. You almost feel tempted to claim it, to drop a crumb of your own story into the map. Maybe Trail Mix Bay, maybe Thermos Cove. Something honest, a nod to the endless lineage of hungry travelers who came before you. The sun slips lower, gilding the ripples with amber light. You close your eyes for a moment and listen. The wind through spruce, the hush of waves, the heartbeat of time slowing. And as your breathing evens out, the story itself begins to fade, not ending, just dissolving into the rhythm of water and wind, like the echo of paddles long gone. The canoe drifts now, untethered, floating on the edge of twilight. The world has gone soft around the edges, the light stretching, the air cooling, the sounds falling away one by one. You let the paddle rest across your knees and feel the gentle pulse of the lake beneath you, steady, ancient, patient. It's strange how quiet the wilderness becomes when you finally stop moving. The mosquitoes give up, the birds hush, and even the trees seem to breathe slower. You realize that the same calm must have settled over the fur traders once their campfires burned low. Bellies full, or at least not empty, they would have watched the stars emerge. The sky reflected perfectly in the lake, and felt that rare kind of peace that only comes after surviving another day. You lean back, let your shoulders drop and breathe it in. The cool air smells faintly of pine and smoke, the kind of scent that feels older than language. Somewhere out there, a loon calls, that haunting, lonely note that sounds like the night itself sighing. You let it carry you deeper into stillness. Every lake you've crossed, every name you've whispered has been a breadcrumb trail through history, one marked not by glory, but by hunger, humor, and the stubborn will to live. And maybe that's the lesson here, that even in the hardest journeys, the smallest joys matter most. A bite of bread, a sip of tea, a laugh shared beside the fire. You let your eyes close. The lake rocks you gently like a slow heartbeat. The map fades. The stories fade. The hunger fades. Only the water remains.